You have asked me to explain the concept of personal identity. And I would like to spend some time first trying to explain what personal identity is and what is the role of personal identity in one's life, and how personal identity could be misjudged or could be misaligned with a person's true personality. Now, personal identity means that how do you identify yourself for yourself and for others. For example, I may identify myself as a man. I may say I am a man. And when I do that, then I am emphasizing my gender as the basis of my identity. Let's say someone says that that person is white or that person is black. Now, these two persons who are identifying themselves in terms of color and race, they are trying to construct their personal identity in the case in the form of race and perhaps sometimes in the form of color. But mostly when somebody says I'm black, they are referring to their race rather than to the color of their skin. Now, there are several ways that human beings construct personal identities. Of course, the most obvious and the most used forms of personal identity are, number one, I think territorial nationality has become a big source of personal identity. For example, you say I'm an American, or I am Mexican, or I am Japanese, or I am Chinese. So when you say these things, perhaps you are emphasizing the nationality basis of your personal identity. Even though in the case of Chinese, perhaps when somebody says I'm Chinese, they may not be referring to the territorial nation state, but they might be referring to a sort of ethnic, cultural, racial identity. It's a very complex set of identities when you say I'm Chinese. Similarly, people may define themselves in terms of religion. I'm a Muslim, or I'm Christian, or I'm Jewish. These are personal identities constructed on the basis of religion. Gender, nationality, religion, race, ethnicity. These are some of the most common and gross identities that people have used and people still use to describe themselves. Now, each identity, conceptually, is a mechanism to belong to a group. So when I say I'm a Muslim, by saying so, first of all, I am disclosing my religion, that I practice or I believe in the religion of Islam. But I'm also saying that I am a member of a group who are Muslims. And similarly, when somebody says I'm Jewish, they are defining themselves in terms of their religion and perhaps also culture. So when I say I'm a Muslim, I am differentiating myself on the basis of religion. And by saying I'm a Muslim, perhaps I'm also saying that I am not Christian, that I am not Jewish, that I'm not Hindu. And therefore, one purpose of personal identity is to exclude the groups that you don't belong to. So, in other words, a personal identity um, does two things. Number one, it shows the group that you belong to, and it also shows the groups that you don't belong to. Because sometimes these identities are mutually exclusive. So when you say you're a Muslim, by definition, you cannot be Hindu or Jewish or Christian. Similarly, when you say, I am Chinese, by definition, you cannot be Japanese or Canadian. So in most cases, not all, in most cases, personal identities are mutually exclusive, and they tell you which group you belong to and which group you don't belong to. Now consider that each person has a set of identities at the same time. For example, I am a man, which means that I am not a woman. I am a Muslim, which means I'm not a Christian or a Jew or a Hindu. I am an American, which means that I am a citizen of the United States, or I live in the United States, or I identify myself with the people who live in this country. I might also say that I was born in Pakistan, which would also disclose that I was not born in America. I'm not a Native American. I'm not an American born in the United States. Even though it just occurred to me that when you say American, a lot of people object to it, because even people in Venezuela and Chile and even Mexico, they all believe they're Americans. But for some reason, the phrase American or the identity of American has been monopolized by the people living in the United States. And so a person living in Chile is not presumed to be American. The person will be called Chilean. But anyway, that's a different debate. So I think I was saying that at any given point in time, a person has acquired a set of identities. And no person has only one identity. You could say I'm an Anglophone, or I'm multilingual. You could say that I am heterosexual. So all these identities simultaneously define your complex personality and your complex being. Now, you should also add that professional identity is also becoming a significant source of self-concept. Now, this word self-concept is also very intriguing in terms of personal identity, because self-concept, in my judgment, and in the context of identities, means that which of the several identities a person chooses to identify himself or herself the most. For example, right now, I am a man, I am Muslim, I am an American, I am a law professor, I am a Kansan because I have lived most of my life in this state and I like Kansas very much. I'm heterosexual. I am a believer. Now, out of all these identities, I could say whenever, my self-concept, in terms of my self-concept, I might say that the most important identity to me, for me, is that I'm Muslim. For example, that simply means that even though I am a man, I am American, I am, law professor, but the identity that I am Muslim, that I believe in Islam, that identity is the most important to me. And I think every person, in most cases, will choose one of the several identities that that person has in order to construct their self-concept. So self-concept could be, doesn't have to be, but it could be one identity as the dominant identity. I think that's another good phrase, that even though you have several identities, what is the dominant personal identity in your self-concept? For example, when somebody says that I'm an American, probably that cannot be his dominant identity, because this identity is most relevant when you are traveling or when you are in some international context. If you're, living in the United States and you will not be going around saying to the people, I'm an American. Of course, most people will be also American. So this identity is not going to help you to identify yourself unless you're in France or unless you're in some foreign country, and then your identity, being an American, suddenly becomes the dominant identity. But in your normal life, the territorial identity or the nation-state identity is not going to be your dominant identity. Similarly, I think that I'm a man or I'm a woman, the gender identity is also so broad that most human beings are either one or the other, that you are not going to construct your self-concept solely on the basis of gender. Even though I think I've seen some people who do that, and I think they're so conscious of their gender that they, wear this identity as part of their self-concept. In the case of women, I think gender identity has created some sort of difficulty because of historical subordination of women and the inferiority attached to the gender, and the exclusion of women from the market and from the professions. Historically, I think now, thankfully, the things are changing. But historically, women were domesticated, they were disempowered, they were taken out of the markets, they were, subscribed to simply raise families and serve their husbands. That stereotypical role of women constructed a gender identity which probably was difficult to embrace as the dominant identity, particularly after the feminist movement. And therefore, a healthy gender identity is now coming into existence for both sexes, men and women. And I think most women are very proud of their gender, and they are not trying to become men. Please note that there was a time when, women started to imitate men in order to, excuse me, in order to assert power. So, dressing up like men, wearing neckties, talking in a certain way, that was the early phase of feminism. And now I think I find that women are very comfortable by saying that we are not men, we are different from men, but we are fine, and there's nothing wrong in being different from men. So similarly, I think in the case of blacks in the United States, there was a period of difficulty because so much inferiority and disempowerment was attached to blackness that black people wanted to pass as whites, particularly those who could with lighter color. And even today, I find some people who have limited black blood in their composition still feel a little bit uncomfortable with being blacks or called blacks. And I understand that because why somebody who's 5% black and 95% white, why he has to be black? That fails my imagination. I would simply say that this person has racial diversity, and I think I've already discussed that in the case of personal diversity, that if you have different and complex racial composition, then that is an asset. It's a personal asset, and your personality is pretty diverse, and you are not one color or one race. But anyway, in terms of identity, even though your racial composition and your personal racial elements are complex, still some people I've seen, they would say they're black, even though they're only 5% black. And therefore, you could say that that personal identity and personal diversity are two different things. Personal diversity means that you have more than one element present in your personality, in your being. And personal identity means that you pick one of those elements in order to construct your self-concept. Once again, if I may refer to race, if you're 5% black and 95% white, you could construct your personal identity as white or black. But in terms of personal diversity, you're both black and white. So please note this point, that personal diversity and personal identity may or may not be the same thing. So I was talking about the dominant personal identity, that even though you are several things at the same time, in order to construct your self-concept, you choose one of the several personal identities as your dominant identity. These days, for example, the gay identity, that you're homosexual, that you're not heterosexual. A lot of people who are homosexual, they would construct their personal identity as gay identity. And this identity has become the dominant identity for them. And that has become the main element of their self-concept. And probably this identity, this dominant identity, is a reaction to the historical oppression perpetrated against homosexuals. Similarly, your dominant identity could simply be a reaction to oppression, that you construct your dominant identity in order to repel oppression. And for example, if you're Jewish and for some reason Jews are being persecuted, you have two options. One is that you simply suppress your Jewish identity. And even though for you it is your dominant identity, you don't project it to the people or to others. Or you could become very militant in reaction to in reaction to oppression, and you may begin to say that indeed I'm Jewish. And so I think dominant identity could be a response to oppression. But not every dominant identity is reactive. I think this is a very simple and important point. That dominant identity is not always a reaction to social pressure or to social oppression or to social exclusion. It is not a militant response to persecution. Dominant identity could be a very normal identity in normal times, when there is no persecution and when there is no social pressure either to reject or embrace a certain identity. And I think this dominant identity that is part of self-concept that a person constructs without any social pressure is the most important identity in terms of self-understanding and in terms of self-actualization. When somebody says that I'm a Muslim and I am going to construct my self-concept around the Islamic identity, and this is my self-concept, and this is the most important personal identity to me, then there are several things which would follow from this self-definition. First of all, other identities will become secondary. The fact that you are a man or a woman doesn't matter because your dominant identity is that you're a Muslim. The fact that you are a Saudi Arabian or Iraqi or Iranian or Pakistani or American doesn't matter because territorial or nation-state identity is there, but it is not your dominant identity. Your dominant identity is that you're a Muslim. Similarly, the fact that you are an accountant or a laborer or a lawyer or a physician or a housewife or a retired person, unemployed, doesn't matter. These identities have become secondary because now your dominant identity, without any pressure and without any reaction, is that you are a Muslim. And now this identity, this personal identity, this self-concept, this dominant identity is going to suppress probably is not a good word. It is going to render other identities secondary. I think the other identities will still be there. You're not going to deny that you're a man. You're not going to deny that you're a physician. You're not going to deny that you were born in Indonesia. You're not going to deny that you are a housewife. But these identities are not critical to the fact that you are a Muslim. You are a Muslim, and therefore you construct your life, you define your day, and you define your night, and you define your existence on this earth, all in terms of being a Muslim. And I think this is a very important point, that your dominant identity becomes the driver of your life. Let me say it again, that the dominant identity is going to drive your life. It is going to determine lots of things in your life. How you treat others, how you treat your children, what is your attitude towards wealth or poverty, what is your attitude towards elegance and convenience and fame. Everything in your life is now going to be defined by your dominant identity. And therefore, it's very interesting that when you study people or when you study yourself, you can figure out how people are driven by their self-concept and how self-concept may have a dominant identity, a central identity that is driving a person's life. Now, unfortunately, some dominant identities are unhealthy, and the whole self-concept becomes problematic. And this problematic dominant identity mostly occurs in a sort of pathological community. And by pathological community, I mean a community that suffers from a social pathology. For example, a religiously intolerant community is a pathological community. A racist community is a pathological community. A community that looks down upon people of certain castes is a pathological community. So any community in which the dominant identity becomes a source of self-pride, but also it's a source for discrimination against others and prejudice against others. This sort of dominant identity occurs in a pathological community. In a healthy community, for example, being a Muslim is fine, and it is a source of great comfort and pride and personal satisfaction that your self-concept is driven by the fact that you're a Muslim. But if it is a pathological community where there is intolerance, religious intolerance, then this very dominant identity that you're a Muslim become either a source of persecution against you, or you could become yourself an oppressor against others. So for example, in Egypt, if you are a Muslim and you are in some pathological relationship with the Coptic community, then the identity that you're a Copt or that you're a Muslim becomes problematic as the dominant identity, because the background facts have constructed a pathological relationship, a pathological community. But if the background facts are healthy, as they have been for many, many centuries, in Egypt, then being a Copt or being a Muslim is perfectly normal. Similarly, in a healthy society, it is perfectly fine to be black or white or some other race. But if the community is racially pathological, which means that the pathology of race has divided the community, and one racial group is prejudicial against the others, and one racial group commits discrimination or violence against the other group, then this community composed of different racial groups is a pathological community. It is not a normal or healthy community. And therefore, if in this pathological community, your dominant identity is that you're white or that you're black, could become an unhealthy and problematic dominant identity. So the point is that self-concept in a pathological community means something totally different than self-concept, the same self-concept in a normal, healthy community. And I think this fact is very important, that how some dominant identities are constructed in order to practice prejudice and discrimination and violence against the groups that are excluded. So when KKK, Ku Klux Klan, emphasizes whiteness as the dominant identity, it is a pathological claim in the sense that the goals of the KKK are unhealthy. They want to construct white pride in order to practice discrimination against non-whites. Now, there's nothing wrong, let me say this, there's nothing wrong if your dominant identity is that you're white, or that you're European, or that, you are of Caucasian race. There's nothing wrong with that. And you should be very happy with this dominant identity, as should be an African or Asian or some other race. Racial identity is a fact, and you simply cannot deny your racial identity. So it is wrong to expect people to deny their racial identity. And I think it's not good for your personal diversity as well. Personal diversity means that you recognize your personal facts. What is wrong with it is that whiteness in a pathological community becomes a source of social prejudice, social discrimination, and even violence. So when dominant identity in a pathological community is asserted in order to perpetrate social injustice, then not only the victims but also the perpetrator, the dominant identity itself becomes pathological. And I think this point must be emphasized, that in a pathological community, the dominant identities that are related to the pathology, they all become unhealthy. So in a racist society, If you think you are white and that is your dominant identity, something is terribly wrong with your self-concept. And in the same racist society, if you're overly obsessed that you're black, it's unhealthy. And you have been forced to emphasize your blackness, even though probably that might not have been your dominant identity if you were living in a black community. I don't think if you live in a predominantly black community, like let's say in Chad, your blackness is not going to be your dominant identity. This dominant identity is only going to be constructed in a racially complex society or in a racially diverse society. But if it is a racially homogeneous society or community, your race is not going to be at the center of your self-definition, because then you would probably pick something else to construct your self-concept. Now, I must say that it is natural to embrace your self-identities. It is natural to realize and accept the fact that you're a man or a woman, that you are American or Canadian or Japanese, or that you are a physician or a laborer. Whatever you construct in terms of your self-definition, there is nothing wrong with it. I would only suggest that you reflect over your self-concept and ask yourself a couple of questions. Number one, you would ask yourself, what is my dominant identity? And then the second question is going to be, why I have chosen this to be my dominant identity. And I think these two questions are going to start a process of self-reflection, which is going to lead towards some very healthy ending. Of course, when you begin this journey of self-reflection, and when you ask yourself, what is my dominant identity? What is the center of my self-concept? What is the focus of my self-definition, and why? Once you ask these two questions, a painful journey is going to begin. And you should not abandon this painful journey. The more painful this journey is, the more you need to stay on this course. Because you have to resolve these two questions for your own satisfaction. It is very likely that at the end of the process, when you have gone through the reflection process, and it's not going to be a few minutes, a few days, it's going to be perhaps many months and perhaps years. And in some cases, all your life. But the process of reflection over your self-concept is going to give you a peace of mind. After painful moments, then the journey of satisfaction begins. And your life becomes a source of great energy. And you become positive. And your energies are released. And you will see that many hidden qualities that your self-concept had suppressed, they come out, almost like flowers. and you smell them, and you're a more beautiful person. And you are the person that was created with gifts, and a person with talents, and a person with love and mercy, and a person with tremendous ability to be human. So that is where I would end. That the purpose of identities is to create a self-concept that is normal, that is healthy, and that brings out the best of your qualities and the best of your talents. Thank you.